9 ways to discover you're autistic. If you were diagnosed autistic later in life, there's a very good chance that a self-discovery process was a big part of your journey. So in this video, I'm going to go through 9 common ways to discover you're autistic. Let's see if one or more relates to you. Hi everyone, Paul Mikulev here from Autism from the Inside. I make weekly videos sharing the human side of autism, so make sure you hit subscribe to get the latest content. So I've noticed a bit of an unconscious myth that exists in mainstream culture, which is essentially to think that the way you figure out you're autistic is a professional notices it in you and tells you and then gives you a diagnosis. And that kind of makes sense from a medical model. That's how we diagnose most of our physical illnesses and even a lot of our mental illnesses. But when it comes to figuring out that you're autistic, in my experience, that is just not a very common way for someone to discover that they're autistic. So I'll go through the 9 most common ways that I've noticed, and I'm really curious to see which ones you relate to. So number 1, and these are in no particular order, is having your child diagnosed first. These days, there's a lot more awareness about autism. Most teachers have at least heard of it before, and many have enough experience to pick up obvious signs if they haven't been noticed already. So in general, our capacity for noticing autism in children and the systems set up for early intervention and support mean that there's a fairly high chance that if you have an autistic child, they'll be identified and diagnosed as a child. Now, obviously, individual results may vary and access to diagnosis is not equitably distributed and things like that. But overall, if your child is autistic, there's a very high chance they will receive a diagnosis before you do. And for many people, this triggers a lot of, yeah, but they're just like me kind of moments. And so learning about what autism is, learning about what normal is, or at least is supposed to be, and then comparing that to your own life and your own experience, and then joining the dots on that and saying, well, actually, this is very, very similar to what I experienced growing up. And so having your child diagnosed ends up being the first step in your own autism self-discovery process. Number 2 is similar if you have a friend or even multiple friends who get an autism diagnosis as an adult. And the reaction is, if you're autistic, I'm clearly autistic too. This is a version of going out and meeting autistic people to learn what autism actually looks like in adults. But it's a bit of a special case because with a close friend, you've probably personally witnessed all their quirky behavior over the years, and maybe even bonded over being very similar in many aspects. So a little bit like learning what autism is through your child, learning about autism through a very close friend who's had a diagnosis could spark your own journey. Number 3. YouTube has clearly seemed to identify me as autistic, or at least keeps recommending me a lot of autistic videos. I've heard this story from quite a few people who tell me that my videos or some others have regularly popped up in their feed, and they start off just ignoring it for a while, but it keeps popping up in their feed, and eventually they click it just out of curiosity. And then of course YouTube feeds them even more autistic themed videos, and you end up inadvertently learning what autism looks like in real adults in real life, which inevitably hits a little bit close to home, really resonating with that, and now your journey is well on the way. Number 4 is reading a book, specifically a memoir of an autistic person. This was actually the case for me. The book I read was Look Me in the Eye by John Elder Robinson, and my experience was typical. I got halfway through the book and I resonated so much with a lot of the things that were being said that it was just beyond a coincidence anymore. I share more about my own diagnosis story in other videos, but essentially I put the book down halfway through, did an online self-assessment quiz. I also made a video on that one if you're interested. And when the official internet diagnosis was probably, I basically picked up the phone, called a local support group, and attended a meeting the very next day. When I arrived, I joked with them that I diagnosed myself online yesterday, fully expecting them to tell me that was ridiculous. But for some reason, no one told me I was ridiculous. Instead, they basically said, "Hey, you found us, welcome home." These days, there are quite a few autistic memoirs out there, which means I'm sure you can find one that you can relate to. Number 5 is a long time search. In this example, it's the kind of person who has always had this niggling question in the back of their mind and just keeps looking for answers, and maybe you get a diagnosis and it doesn't quite feel right, or maybe you find another answer and it sort of answers some of the questions, but it doesn't quite put all the pieces together. And you've been looking for a long time until finally you learn a more accurate idea about what autism is, and suddenly all the pieces seem to make sense. I can relate to this one quite a bit as well, because I had some kind of idea what autism was from like culture and TV and things like that. I even remember, as I was working as an engineer, hearing a statistic that engineers are more likely to have autistic children. And I remember having a bit of a laugh at that and say, yeah, well, it's just that engineers are more likely to be autistic, obviously. But still, at that time, I did not put 2 and 2 together about myself. At the time, diagnosing myself as an engineer and having that as a label that described pretty much everything that I felt was important at the time, I didn't really see the need to keep looking for a better explanation. Number 6 deserves its own category: getting diagnosed with ADHD first. Sometimes ADHD can be easier to recognize, and it also has clear treatment options, which often make a really big difference straight away. And so finding something like that seems to answer so many unanswered questions, on the one hand, it's really good because you're starting to understand yourself better. But on the other hand, it might take a little bit of time to realize that there's actually more to the story than that single diagnosis. That said, just knowing that there's a high chance of co-occurrence of both might be enough to start asking the right questions, which eventually leads to finding that missing piece. So far with these first 6 ways, we've been looking at some fairly benign examples, but unfortunately now we need to move to some of the more significantly less nice ways. Number 7 of these 9 ways to discover you're autistic: major burnout. I was fine, I was coping, I was getting everything done. Yes, I was stressed, but I was always finding a way to keep it all together, and now I'm not. Sometimes you can see the signs of burnout building up for many years, but we all have big stresses in our life, right? How do you know when it's going to tip from stressful but I can manage this to complete overwhelm and burnout? When there's a crash of this magnitude, it's very clear to everyone involved that things are not okay. And that's when trying to find answers to questions like, how could this happen, leads to uncovering all the hidden challenges that the person has been dealing with silently their whole life. Number 8 is similar, but in this case, the crash is due to a big life change. What are some examples of a big life change? It could be a pandemic, or a divorce, or a redundancy, or the birth of your first child. For me, the big life change that led to my first major crash in my mid-20s was transitioning to full-time work. I was doing really well at university, I had a great social network, I was very well supported, but I just did not cope with working 8 to 10 hours in an engineering office every day. So essentially, a big change leads to needing to find an entirely new set of coping strategies. And if we don't do that quickly enough or successfully enough, a major life crisis of the order of losing your partner, losing your job, major burnout, that type of thing, is often just around the corner. So clearly, this is not a very nice way to find out you're autistic. When virtually everything in your life is falling apart, having a name for that and blaming a neurological condition is not all that reassuring sometimes. It can be really helpful when finding ways to get through it and come out the other side, but sometimes it basically leaves the individual believing that there must be something wrong with me and that's why my whole life is falling apart right now. Because it's my fault. I don't know what I did wrong, but clearly I'm the problem. Hopefully, with more awareness in society, we can help people discover that they're autistic in one of the first 6 ways and hopefully prevent these kind of major life catastrophes from happening in the first place. So I said I'd share 9 ways to discover you're autistic. So what's the 9th one? Well, I've saved the most boring until last. The final one on my list of how to discover you're autistic is to have it suggested to you by your psychologist. Why is this the most boring way? Well, firstly, it plays into the social myth that it's the most common way. And secondly, it's not really a self-discovery process if someone else discovers it for you. It's a bit like saying, yeah, my doctor tells me I have low iron apparently. I don't know what they're talking about. Until it actually means something to you personally, then it's just a medical professional giving you a label. Fortunately though, this can be the start of a genuine self-discovery process. And I know lots of people who eventually discovered their own autism because it was first suggested to them by their psychologist. You will note, however, that of these 9 ways to discover you're autistic, almost none of them start with a professional diagnosis. Which means that for a lot of people, the question of, do I get a diagnosis, is more like asking the question, do I get this discovery verified by someone else? Because actually they already have an answer. Which is why a lot of autistic adults do not have an official diagnosis. And is also why almost all the autistic groups that I'm aware of recognize self-diagnosis as equally valid. And the only reason I said almost is because I like to be 100% correct, and it was just in case there's a group that I can't think of right now that doesn't recognize self-diagnosis. But if a group like that exists, I would be very surprised, because there are such a high proportion of self-diagnosed adults. For several reasons, not least of which being that diagnosis is a very costly process, and if you've already got an answer to all the questions that you're asking, then it may not necessarily give you much extra out of the process. It would definitely be fantastic if one day all health professionals had an accurate view of autism so they could play a more active role in helping the community and especially undiagnosed autistic individuals in that community. But that's one day, and for now we'll have to settle for more organic ways of sharing autistic lived experience so that we can all more easily recognize and accept it in ourselves and others. As usual, my advice if you want to understand autism is to go out and meet autistic people. And if you think you might be autistic yourself, you might like to check out the Autism from the Inside online social group on Facebook. There are regular Zoom meetings you can join. We also have a Discord server. And if you're in Melbourne, we also have a number of in-person meetups as well. So I might leave it there for this video today. I'm curious which of the 9 ways I mentioned resonated most strongly with you, or is there a 10th common way that I forgot to mention? Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.